And the key thing was payoff. There was so much payoff based on the little things that we built up week after week and relationship after relationship. And the more I think about it, the more payoff comes from the relationships that you build with the NPCs, but it has to be player centric. You know, it can't be, it's not about how amazing this NPC is. It's about how, even if that NPC is amazing, this PC changed their life, and this is now the payoff you get to see later down the road. To speak to the mechanics of the final battle, I thought it was brilliant, because not only was it an anti-party in that it was evident that you had made decisions to counter certain party members, it didn't make them useless. So an example is that one of our party members was doing the Sorlock build with Eldritch Blasts, you know? And the Mage Slayer, he was like a monk. I have no idea what his actual class stuff was. But
yeah.
His whole thing was that he had the Mage Slayer feat, which made it so that basically our party full of spellcasters, he was getting free shots off of every round, and we had disadvantage on our concentration checks. So we had to like really think twice. He also had a coat of force resistance. So our Warlock, who was just so used to like Eldritch Blast is my thing, you know, all of a sudden wasn't working as well. But now she had to pay attention to the other pieces in play that didn't have resistance to force damage. So it wasn't something that shut her down completely, but it was an extra challenge that made us rethink how we should approach our resource allocation. Resource being, you as a player take on this piece on the map differently. I'll handle this thing, you know. So it was like a very interesting encounter because of that, you know.
Oh, well, I'm glad to hear it, because yeah, I wasn't sure, because I really didn't want to like shut down any one particular character, like you're saying there, because I know I've seen that happen to me, not entirely, but like,
yeah,
I've played the Sorlock build. I've gone against enemies that are resistant to force damage.
Yeah.
And so it's like, I thought, like, besides not being able to cast and quicken Eldritch Blast, like I will always love to do, and do 8d10 damage if I hit them all.
Yeah.
It made me think about what other possibilities there were for my spells. And for Alakai, in this case, who is the Sorlock, she's also a Yanti, and she had, I gave her Acid Ball, which is basically reskin Fireball, and that it has a lingering effect as well, because I thought, you know, like we were talking about a couple episodes ago about Acid Stream and how that lingers.
Right.
It only makes sense, you know, why not? Why shouldn't all the acid spells linger?
Yeah.
And so I gave her that, and I didn't give any of the enemies acid resistance or anything like that.
Yeah.
And I actually made them vulnerable. This is one thing that I thought was a slight mistake, a slight miscalculation. I made them some of them vulnerable to necrotic damage, and I had forgotten that many of the characters in this party use necrotic damage. So that was my mistake.
Yeah, to me that's not a mistake though. That made the battle that much more interesting. Yeah, because it meant that there was something clear that we had in our toolbox that we could pivot to, you know? So, and that's one of the things that I do in almost every single monster I have now has some kind of resistance and some kind of vulnerability. Because, you know, the other thing is, so the Mage Slayer, it was funny because my character was Alucard, like from Hellsing. The Mage Slayer was Anderson, like from Hellsing. And it was just a very, like, didn't even try to cover it up or reflavor it. It's just we got these two characters from this awesome anime we both like in D&D rules. But because he's a priest, he had resistance to radiant damage. So he was resistant to radiant, he was resistant to force. It would make sense that if he has a resistance to radiant, that may lend to a vulnerability in another area. So even though, yes, a lot of us had access to necrotic spells, it wasn't like a mistake. To me, it kept it balanced, you know, where it was like, now that it's harder to defeat him in this one area, it's a lot easier in another. Another example of this, and we'll get to this in a little bit, was in a Grey Owls game that all of us played last night, we were fighting an airship. The airship might have a high armor class, but it does not have a high dexterity save,
Yeah.
So if it's big, clunky, and tough, it might not be as fast. So there might be a specific category of abilities that we can draw on in order to be more successful. And of course, this is because the RPGs I grew up on were like Pokemon, where like the vulnerabilities and resistances of each creature were so structured into the world that it was an of course, and it would make sense that, like, what does it say about a creature if it's, vulnerable to necrotic damage, versus vulnerable to radiant damage, If a player is thinking through from a story perspective, what would make sense to use against this creature, and they're rewarded with vulnerability, that now makes the rules of the world make more sense, So if it's like, I have a fire creature and it's vulnerable to cold damage, that makes sense, If you've got like a werewolf and it's vulnerable to fire damage, there might be like you're following lore and stuff, and that would kind of make sense for it,
Thank you so much for listening to some of our podcast highlights. This podcast is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network. If you want to support the content creators, feel free to visit our Patreon, and please, game responsibly.